Now, what would you do with all the money in the world? Would you end hunger? Maybe buy a Maybach? Or simply disappear? I'm Bob from World 5 List. Step into the vault as I show you 8 millionaires who simply disappeared. Number 8. Steve Fossett. A California native, Steve Fossett was an accomplished businessman with record-breaking aviation skills, a sailor, and an adventurer who'd taken to the skies ever since he was in college. His adventurous edge would drive him to accomplish many feats in his life. In fact, Fossett had broken many records in his life, including becoming the first person to fly across the Pacific in a hot air balloon in 1995, getting his hot air balloon to reach a record-breaking speed of 200.24 miles an hour in 2002, making his Zeppelin reach a record-breaking speed of 71.5 miles an hour in 2004, traveling a record-breaking 3,186 miles by hot air balloon in one day, and reaching a record-breaking altitude of 50,727 feet with his glider in 2006. Yet none of it was enough, because Fossett is also on record as becoming the first person to fly around the entire world via hot air balloon as well. On September 3rd of 2007, Fossett would take off in his single-engine Super Decathlon in Smith Valley, Nevada, and never returned. When he failed to come back, search parties were then sent out just 6 hours later in hopes of finding him. Then, on September 19th, authorities would stop looking for Fossett altogether. A year later, on September 29th of 2008, investigators would finally make some headway on the case when a group of hikers stumbled across a couple of identification cards belonging to Fossett in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, which was about 65 miles south from where he took off. Then, on October 1st, search parties finally found the place where Fossett had crashed, and with it, identified bone fragments that belonged to the millionaire, finally putting the mystery to rest. Number 7. Cam Lyman. Cam Lyman, born Camilla Lowell Lyman in Westwood, Massachusetts, was a multimillionaire breeder of champion clumber spaniels and a known recluse. He was also transgender, and it was after he began to identify as a man that he would run into some trouble, because it was then that he eventually befriended a man by the name of George O'Neill, who would eventually become his caretaker of the estate and Lyman's prize-winning dogs by 1985. Then in 1987, when Cam's family failed to receive their yearly Christmas card, they became just a little bit concerned. And it was then that they would learn that no one had actually heard from Cam in several months. When the police went to question George, he claimed that the two of them had gotten into a fight over the phone. The next day, George says that he went to Cam's house to see that Cam had actually ripped the phone out of the wall. George also believed that Cam had gone to Europe in order to finish his sex reassignment surgery. But when questioned further, George actually failed to provide any kind of evidence that Cam had actually gone to Europe, and also didn't have any answers when asked why he didn't tell anyone about why he hadn't seen Cam in over 6 months. Then, in 1997, the mystery appeared to be all but solved when a couple would discover Lyman's body inside of a septic tank in Rhode Island. However, no one has ever been charged in Cam's murder, and although O'Neill did go to prison in 2003, it wasn't for the murder of Cam Lyman. No, he's serving his time for actually embezzling $15,000 from Lyman's estate. Number 6. Ambrose Small. Born in 1863, Ambrose Joseph Small was a successful Canadian theatre magnate who owned several properties, which included 3 opera houses in Ontario, and was also the controller of 62 other buildings. His success would bring him millions, but then on December 1st of 1919, Small apparently decided that he'd had enough and sold all of the properties for what amounted to $1.7 million. The very next day, Small left his office in the Toronto Grand Opera House with his attorney, F.W.M. Flock, and never returned. When police tried to find out what had happened to him, no one seemed to know when exactly Small had left his office. At first, nobody really took notice of his disappearance because he had a habit of being a womanizer who frequently disappeared to go on sexual exploits. However, a month had gone by, and in January of 1920, Flock, along with Small's wife Teresa, became alarmed when Ambrose failed to return and contacted the police. Small also didn't seem to have a motive for actually disappearing on his own either. The money that he earned from selling his properties was exactly where he had left it. The police would do an extensive search for any clues as to what might have happened, but all of their attempts ended in failures. With no leads in sight, the case of Ambrose Small's disappearance was closed in 1960, and to this day, nobody knows what actually happened to the Canadian millionaire. Number 5. GUMA AGUIAR. Now, GUMA AGUIAR was a wealthy Brazilian industrialist and philanthropist who spent much of his time in the United States and Israel, and also donating millions of dollars to charitable causes like Nefesh B'Nefesh and March of the Living. Life did seem to be pretty good for GUMA, who married his high school sweetheart Jamie Elizabeth Black in 2005 and was also the CEO of Lior Energy. Now, aside from all of that, he did have a domestic abuse protective order that was filed against him, and he was also charged with possession of marijuana in 2009, and otherwise had a pretty clean record. Then, in June of 2012, he would board a 31-foot boat by the name of the TT Zion, never to be seen again. The boat landed at Fort Lauderdale Beach, fully functional and running, but GUMA was nowhere to be found. No signs of foul play could be detected, and all of his belongings, like his wallet and phone, were found on board. After a search of his home, though, authorities found that his watch and wedding band had been left behind, which would have been strange for the man to do. After an exhaustive search and no leads, his body was never found, and he was declared legally dead in 2015. Number 4. Arthur Kingsley Porter. Born in 1883, Arthur Kingsley Porter was many things. This included a millionaire, an art historian, a medievalist, and an expert on Romanesque sculpture. Arthur had an eclectic and talented life, being born into a wealthy family, attending Yale where he received a Bachelor of Fine Arts, and then later in the 1920s, he began to travel around Europe, giving lectures at prestigious universities as he went, winning fame for himself and presenting new theories for all of those who would listen. But Arthur Kingsley Porter also fell off the face of the earth. Now, all I know is that he disappeared sometime in 1933. Most people simply assume that he presumably drowned while taking a ride on his boat. Number 3. Don Lewis. Jack Dom Lewis was a self-made millionaire. He was also the co-founder of the Wildlife on Easy Street, now known as Big Cat Rescue, making his fortune in the real estate business. Nobody really knows a whole lot about the disappearance of Don Lewis, but one thing that is known for sure is that he did disappear under mysterious circumstances on August 18th of 1997. No one was ever charged or even held suspect for Jack's disappearance, even though the spouse is often the first person that police look at, and witnesses say that he did often get into fights with his wife Carol, now the CEO of the company that he started. Sounds kind of suspicious if you ask me. Number 2. Eddie Antar. Eddie Antar might have been a high school dropout, but he wasted absolutely no time getting fame and fortune. He would quickly set to work, making his money in the electronics industry and also becoming the owner of Crazy Eddie, an electronics chain with 43 locations in the northeastern United States. However, in the 1970s, Eddie's electronics empire would all begin to crumble, and his stores started to fail one by one. Eddie got a little bit desperate, marking down all of his products, and at one point even offering to accept shoes for stereos. Even then, his empire continued to fall. So, getting even more desperate, he then turned to stealing by withholding the sales tax on his products. Even so, he soon caught the eye of investigators, who then charged him with fraud. Thinking that he could evade the police if he dropped off the grid, Eddie then fled to Israel in 1990 and had seemingly disappeared and fallen off the face of the earth. However, 2 years later, Eddie would be apprehended and taken into custody. Number 1. Kevin McGeever. McGeever claimed to have been many things, including a roofing contractor, a doctor, a psychologist, a best-selling author, and president of the fictional World Trust Bank. According to one report, McGeever tended to have a pretty predictable pattern. He'd pursue one fake profession and then abandon it when people would become too suspicious. So, what exactly did McGeever accomplish with all of those cons? Well, after a con where he invented a fake bank that brought in some $8.8 million, $2 million of which McGeever made off with when investors began to get suspicious, McGeever then managed to con his way into a fairly lavish lifestyle. He purchased himself a Lamborghini, a Ferrari, a Porsche G2, then in 2014, it got really interesting when McGeever would put his car in storage and hired 2 men to drive him to his cottage in Western Ireland. After 8 months, McGeever apparently got bored of the ruse and had someone drop him off along the road. He must have really been dedicated to his alibi, because when he was found by a local motorist, he evidently was also starving. He'd grown out a beard and even his fingernails, and to top it all off, he came up with the absurd idea of writing the word thief on his head in permanent marker. After this, he was taken to the station where he told the cops a very wild tale of how he'd been abducted and tortured, with a group of masked men keeping him hostage for 8 months until he was finally freed. What would you have done with McGeever if you were the police? And what do you think about the others on my list? Let me know all about it in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed for more videos in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again.